Hi, everybody. This is Sam.
And this is Dillon, and welcome to the Church Chatter Podcast.
This is episode 5 on the phrase, turn the other cheek, and a couple other similar phrases. So like always, we're going to jump right into it. Today, we are specifically going to break down the culture behind the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 38 through 41, which reads, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." So this text is from the famous Sermon on the Mount. Dillon, can you give a little context to the Sermon on the Mount?
Yeah, so the Sermon on the Mount comes to us in St. Matthew's Gospel, which is actually chapters 5, 6, and 7. And in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of St. Matthew's Gospel, we get the Sermon on the Mount. Most people, when they think about the Sermon on the Mount, they think of the Beatitudes. But we're not talking about the Beatitudes today. We're talking about some of Jesus's other teachings. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most powerful teachings of Jesus. So a lot of times Christians will talk about following the life and teachings of Jesus. The life part we remember a lot with special moments in Jesus's life, but the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus, which Christians are called to follow, most of which we find them in the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's what we'll be talking about today.
So we've said this, I think, every single episode so far, but Jesus was a Jew. So he was very familiar with Jewish teachings from the Torah. So Exodus and Leviticus say a lot about getting revenge. But Jesus, he was a good Jew. He wasn't teaching something separate from Jewish teachings, but he was expanding on it. So he was teaching this new way of living. So the Sermon on the Mount was not a lecture or a sermon about being passive in the face of power, right? A lot of people will say, turn the other cheek, meaning like, oh, just ignore it. But that's not at all the original meaning. That's not what Jesus was saying. So I like to study the culture behind this stuff. So that's what I'm going to do right now, is just give you some of the cultural context behind these phrases from Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount. So let's just go line by line. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This appears in the Torah, which Jesus was very familiar with, in Exodus chapter 21, verses 23 to 25, in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 19 to 20, and in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21. So this law was in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, specifically the Torah in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Also, this law can be seen outside the law of Moses, outside the Bible too. For example, Roman law has something called the law of equals, which is similar. And then there's the ancient Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. So if you didn't know, Dillon, before he was going to go to seminary, he was actually planning to go to law school. He was on track to go to law school. He has a degree in legal studies. So I'm going to let him talk about the Code of Hammurabi a little bit.
Oh, I'm so glad that you allow me to talk about the Code of Hammurabi. I could talk about the Code of Hammurabi for a very long time, but I'll spare you all the boredom. I'll just give you some brief things here. So the Code of Hammurabi is, what's going on is, this is an ancient legal code in the Babylonian Empire, so in Babylon. It's around the years 1755 to 1750 BC. That's before Christ or before the Common Era. And so it is a very interesting as well as ancient legal text. It is the oldest legal text of its kind, and it pulls together things like criminal codes, family codes, property, commerce and trade, and commercial codes, and it kind of gives an outline of how a society should live under the rule of law, and once again it comes from the ancient Babylonians. Interestingly enough, the Israelite people who would eventually evolve into being the Jewish people, they were enslaved by the Babylonians for a very long time, and so once they were no longer enslaved by the Babylonians, they went and they were able to live in their own way with their own people under their own laws. But The parallels here between Hammurabi's code found in Babylon and the Mosaic law given by Moses that we see in like Deuteronomy and Leviticus in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, you'll see a lot of parallels because the Hammurabi code and the Mosaic law coming out of the tradition of Moses are very similar in that some of the very things that were in Hammurabi's code were placed also in the Mosaic code. And it's also very interesting because you have people who were enslaved but now free implementing the very rules and laws under which they were enslaved, which is slightly interesting. And so when you see the Mosaic laws about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and all those other things, a lot of those things are coming from Hammurabi's code, which comes from ancient Babylon.
Yeah, and just to make that really clear, I don't know if you said this super directly, but the people that were following Moses, his community, they were formerly enslaved, the Babylonian exile. They were enslaved by the Babylonians who had this Hammurabi code. So that's why it was kind of carried over into the Hebrew text then.
Yeah, I thought I made that clear, but maybe
you probably did.
Maybe I did not. Yeah. But
the
one real interesting thing as well is in the very very early days of the world, there were other legal codes, not codified codes like Hammurabi's, which has become very formalized. But the idea was if you stole something, you'd be killed. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. You stole something and you would be killed. Hammurabi's code for the ancient people was rather progressive in that, no, we would no longer just kill you for stealing something, but we'd chop off your hand. Mm-hmm. Now, for 21st century modern day people, we find that to be heinous and gross and inhumane, and I would never advocate for something like that. And yet I'm reminded that that this was a type of progressive understanding of justice for its day. Today, we would no longer think that is the case. But I just wanted to offer that up a little bit.
Yeah, so an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This has been abused, but it was supposed to limit punishment, not expand it, is the main point. So those in power were punishing people beyond what was equal. They were killing people for petty crimes, and this law was stating that the punishment should match the crime. So they weren't expanding it, they were trying to limit it. And of course, people in power took this, flipped it, and abused it.
And it was still very inhumane.
Yes,
I can't say that enough.
So we're going to go line by line, but hang in there with us because there is a point to all of this. So next, Jesus says, do not resist an evildoer. To resist somebody who has power over us, it's to oppose and defy them. So resistance is, to be clear, a very normal human response to evil. But Jesus is teaching us a practice beyond mere resistance to those who have power over us. When Jesus says, do not resist an evildoer, he is setting up what he's about to say next, which is, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. This is my personal favorite line of the entire Bible. I love it so much. I think it's so powerful and misunderstood in our culture today. So, turn the other cheek. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. So during Jesus's time, the right hand was the hand of power. It's part of the reason we say the right hand of God, right? Symbolically, the right hand was the hand of power. There's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is they didn't have toilet paper back then. The way that they would clean themselves is using the left hand. So the right hand is what you did things with because your left hand was unclean. So, the right hand was the hand of power, and it's what you use to hit people. And you had two options to hit people. You could slap somebody with the back of your hand, like to backhand somebody, or you could punch somebody. Now, you punched your equal, and you backhanded somebody lower than you. Culturally, that's how it was. So if somebody was equal to you on the socioeconomic hierarchy, just like we have today, then you would punch them. That's acknowledging that they're your equal. But somebody who is lower than you, like an enslaved person or a poor person or a child or a criminal, you would backhand them. So pretend that there's somebody right now standing across from you. If you were to backhand them with your right hand, it's their right cheek that you would be slapping. So if that person turned their left cheek, it becomes awkward to backhand them now, right? So imagine somebody backhands you on your right, cheek, you turn your left cheek to them. They can't backhand you anymore. It's very awkward. If they want to hit you again, they're forced to punch you. And this is a social acknowledgement that you are an equal and not lower than them. So if you think about Harry Potter, if you've ever read Harry Potter or watched the movies, it's almost like the idea in Harry Potter that Dobby becomes free when his master gives him an old sock or an item of clothing. So during Jesus's time, if somebody with power punched somebody lower than them on the social hierarchy, it was a symbolic statement that they were not their master. So again, just this cultural context kind of clarifies what Jesus was saying by turn the other cheek. And then Jesus goes on to say, if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. So some context here is triple taxation, if you've heard of that before, is the concept or the idea that, or the fact rather, that Jews were being triple taxed. They were taxed by the Roman Empire who conquered them. They were taxed by the temple, and they were taxed by the Herodians. The Romans were clearly not using these taxes to help everybody. They were, just like a lot of governments do, making themselves rich. The temple had become corrupt by this point from Roman influence, and the Herodians were essentially the violent local government. And scholars have actually estimated that Jews were paying about 90% of their income in taxes, which is absurd. So that all that is to say that Jewish people, the Israelites, they were struggling. Now, Jesus was a Jew who studied the Torah, and Exodus chapter 22, verses 26 to 27 says this: if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. So if a person was deep into debt, their coat would be taken to pay off their debt. This would be done publicly at the city gates. It was very embarrassing. It was very shameful, right? So Jesus was saying that if somebody is trying to take advantage of you and to humiliate you like this, give them everything. Literally give them the clothes off your back. So in our culture, it's shameful to be seen naked in public. So if I were to strip right now and go outside naked, that's embarrassing for me. But in Jesus's culture, the shame belonged to the person who was seeing the nakedness rather than the one who was naked. So that's a really important cultural component. So if you gave your cloak, you are forcing the person to both break Jewish law, as seen in Exodus, and to have shame. So again, Jesus is kind of flipping power on its head there. And then Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, goes on to say, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. So to go the extra mile, I know I've heard of like teachers and coaches telling people like, go the extra mile. That is not originally what Jesus means here. Jesus is not telling people, just go the extra mile, try really hard. So context, Israel was conquered by the Roman Empire, and there was little access to horses for carrying equipment. So Roman law allowed Roman soldiers to force a Jew to carry equipment for up to 1 mile at a time. It didn't matter what else you were doing. So you could be with your family, you could be working, it didn't matter. If a Roman soldier told you, a Jewish person, to carry equipment for 1 mile, you had to stop what you were doing and you had to do it. But the rule was 1 mile, no more. So when Jesus says, go another mile, he's actually forcing the Roman soldier to break Roman law there. So again, flipping power on its head. By the way, this law you can see in practice during Jesus' crucifixion when a man is forced to carry Jesus' cross. This law is coming into play. A Roman soldier orders somebody. Do you remember the person's name? Something of Cyrene or something? I forget.
I think,
I'm sure we'll cover it on another episode.
Cyrene.
So, we see this with the Jesus' cross, somebody else carrying it for up to 1 mile in Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23. Whew, so that was a lot of context.
It was good stuff.
Good stuff. I find it really interesting. So what does all this mean for us today? So let's just ground it a little bit. To turn the other cheek, or to give the clothes off your back, or to go the extra mile. These phrases, I believe, have been hijacked by our culture of toxic positivity and our capitalistic values, and we use them to tell people, right, when we say turn the other cheek, oftentimes what's implied there in our culture today is, oh, just ignore it, just be passive. And when we tell someone to, like, oh, she's so nice, she would literally give you the clothes off her back, right? We think that means like, oh, so selfless, so kind. Or if someone says, just go the extra mile, we think that means to try harder. That is not the original meaning of these phrases. That is not what Jesus was talking about. These phrases and teachings from Jesus are not about living in a constant state of service and just taking the abuse from those with power. It's actually it's a powerful and creative and brilliant way to flip power on its head. And for me, the Jesus story is so wrapped up in resisting oppressive powers. I can't even understand the Jesus story without understanding the oppressive powers of the day. It does nothing for me if I don't know how the Jews were being oppressed during the day. So this is really important, again, just to ground it a little more in our current political climate. So my disclaimer to what I'm about to boldly say is that, of course, healthy boundaries are important. It's okay to not see people sometimes. You do not have to be available to everybody all the time. However, in our current political climate, when your candidate or your party doesn't win an election, the path to true change and peace on earth, and if you're a person of spirituality or you identify as a Christian, peace on earth is part of the point, right? So that's part of the teaching. That's part of the point. Peace internally, but also peace externally on earth with all people and things and creation. So the path to permanent peace, it's not to delete and unfriend anybody who voted differently from us. It's not to ignore anybody and to demonize anybody who's different from us. That's not helpful. That's not what Jesus was talking about. Do not return evil for evil. Jesus is not telling us to seek revenge. Jesus is especially not telling us to conquer our enemies. This is all very short-sighted. This has literally never worked in history. Not once. We have no record of this working in history. When we respond to oppressive power by oppressing, it keeps the violence and hatred in circulation, and we're contributing to the problem. So this is also, to be clear, this is not Jesus saying it's all butterflies and rainbows and that we should just lay down for those with power to walk all over us and be besties with them and go out for brunch with people we disagree with. That's also not what Jesus is saying. He wasn't hanging out with the emperor who was responsible for all of this. That's also not what Jesus is saying. This is not a teaching about forgiveness and acceptance like a lot of pastors like to spin it. There are other Christian teachings about forgiveness and acceptance, but this is not one of them. Instead, this is about finding creative and efficient ways to neutralize power, not to take power back, no matter how small that action is. I'm just really going to beat a dead horse here because I really love talking about this stuff. But this is Jesus teaching his followers something that continues to be true today, that those at the top, those with the power, they are vulnerable too. And you just have to find a way to work with that and to flip it on its head. These people with power seemingly are powerful and in control, but ultimately on a long enough timeline, they are very weak and temporary. So anybody who has ever gone to a 12-step recovery meeting, you've probably heard that you can only keep what you give away.
Oh, that's good.
You can only keep what you give away. This means that true and permanent power can only be kept if it's given away. And I'm going to talk more about this. So when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, he is challenging power without trying to take power for himself. He's fighting against oppression without becoming the oppressor. And that's, I think, part of the path of a spiritual life is how can we share power with everybody without becoming the people with the ultimate power. So let's really ground that. And I'll just call out myself and my parts of my own identity for this rather than picking on others, although we could see it anywhere. So I'm a feminist. However, mainstream feminist rhetoric, it often does this thing that's really problematic where it talks about women being in power, right? Feminism in its most beautiful form, it's not about women taking charge and becoming the ones with the power. It's about equalizing power so everybody has it. Power is not a pie that we slice up, right? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't know math. It's something that everybody should have access to. This is why we have one war after another throughout known human history. The violence and the effort to maintain this illusion of power, The metaphor I use is like a tennis ball that we just keep hitting back and forth. I know Dylan's a tennis player, so he likes
I
that
love this. This is such a great
metaphor.
metaphor.
But I picture it like this tennis ball, and we just keep hitting it back and forth, right? Like, oh, you're being violent towards my people, I'm going to turn around and be violent towards your people, and then it just keeps hitting it back and forth, keeping this anger and violence and war and all these things in circulation. And these teachings from Jesus is telling his followers, I know that tennis didn't exist back then, but put your tennis racket down and stop grasping for power altogether. Stop keeping this in circulation and just stop hitting that ball. We're playing a different game now. So hang in there with me because I have a point to make about this. But we live in a kind of society that's called a patriarchy. Even if women are the ones in all the positions of power all over the world, we're still left with a patriarchy. A matriarchy is not a society with women at the top of the hierarchy. A true matriarchy is not a hierarchy of power at all. It's actually a circle. Instead of like a top-down hierarchy of power, it's a circle of power with women at the center. And what happens when you have women at the center of a society? You have caretaking, nurturing, and collaboration also at the center of the society. And because it's a circle with things like caretaking and community and collaboration at the center of it as its values, rather than a top-down hierarchy, power does not belong to those at the top, but instead is shared equally among every member of the society. People have different roles, of course, but every role is seen as equally valued. No role is better or worse than another. So that's what a true matriarchy is. This means that a true matriarchy, nobody can have more or less value than another person. And this means that nobody is fighting over power, which kind of gets rid of that violence component, because if everybody's valued the same, again, not that everybody is the same, but everybody's valued the same, there's no need to fight over maintaining power. And anthropologists, they have studied these societies for a long time. There's even some that exist today. And to be super clear, I'm not advocating for a matriarchy. The reason I bring this up is because the way our culture does power, where people at the top have some and other people don't, this is not and never has been the only option. Jesus is teaching another option when he tells us to turn the other cheek or to go the extra mile or to give the clothes off your back, right? He isn't telling us to go to war, to take back the powerful positions from those in power. He's teaching a whole new way to flip power on its head.
That was excellent.
Yeah, I could talk about this for a long time.
That was excellent.
I am very interested in power structures and how it could work and how it does work.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add? Because I can keep going.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we really hit the nail on the head with that.
Okay.
Or shall I say you did?
This is obviously one of my favorite things to talk about. So we can end by... I just have a couple more things to say to close out here. So to turn the other cheek, to give the clothes off your back, to go the extra mile, Jesus was telling his fellow Jews who were scared and they were in danger and they felt disempowered. He was telling them that those in power are vulnerable. So if you feel in our current political world disempowered in any way, Jesus's message here is also for you and for me. So a kind of like psychological truth is that when people are angry, you can start to notice this in yourself, but you can also see it in other people. Where there is anger, there is always a sense of disempowerment. So when I find that I'm angry, a question on my best days is, if I find myself feeling anger, I will ask myself, where do I feel disempowered? Somewhere in this situation, I feel like I don't have any power. And that's where the anger comes out. And I think Jesus, in all of his wisdom, understood that Jewish people, rightfully so, are angry. They're oppressed. They're angry. And Jesus had followers. And I believe that Jesus was capable of building an army if he wanted to, but he didn't. He was teaching, so if you're interested in the scholarship of it or books, it's called The Third Way. Jesus was teaching a third way. So when somebody is in a position of power, they inevitably need to find a way to keep that power. And if you're in a constant state of maintaining power, you are also in a constant state of anxiety, right? That feeling of like grasping for power. I have to keep it. That's a state of anxiety. And where there is anxiety, there's always an effort to control and restrict. And this control cannot last forever. Again, to ground it, I'll get a little vulnerable here. If I wake up and I have a lot to do and I'm feeling overwhelmed and I have anxiety, the first thing that I will start to do is start to control my family. I will start to tell Dylan what he should be doing. I'll start to get snippy with my children and tell them to clean up, and I have these restrictions and these, like, I just start to control. And I think that's a universal truth. Where there is anxiety, there is a need to control. So if you are in a position of power, you need to find a way to keep that power. So you're in this constant state of anxiety and you're going to control people, right? So this control, what Jesus was teaching is those who are working hard to keep their power, the Roman Empire, they're constantly trying to conquer and to keep war going so that they can keep their power. They're anxious. This is a mask for fear, weakness, anxiety, and ultimately vulnerability. Jesus knew this, right? So any empire or system with all the power at the top, it inevitably gets top heavy and the entire structure weakens. We see this in history over and over again, and empires always fall. So the Jews were angry because they were disempowered. Those with power had anxiety and were controlling. So Jesus wasn't trying to become the oppressive power. He was trying to empower in a productive, efficient way people who were angry, the Jews who were angry, and resist. Really, Jesus, simply put, with this whole turning the other cheek stuff, he was saying we need to resist oppressive power without becoming them. And we see this in the Bible over and over again, and just in human history. An example is King Solomon, who ruled the people who were previously enslaved, built a temple with slave labor, right?
Yeah.
So people who become liberated eventually then oppress people in the same way they were oppressed. And Jesus is trying to teach another way. How can we resist oppressive power structures without replacing them?
Many times people, especially who are Christians, will say that in Jesus we see the personality, the fullness of God, and it's interesting. A lot of people will ask me sometimes, why are you a Christian? Why do you follow Jesus? And the first thing I always say to them is this: that's what I was given. That's what I was brought up with. That's what I was born into. I was born into the Christian faith, and the teachings of Jesus were given to me. And if I was born somewhere else, I'm sure I would have different teachings with a different person and a different religion, but that's not where I am right now. And I respect all religions, but as a Christian, I follow the teachings of Jesus. And what has really transformed my own life and continues to transform many, many others is the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus, which have and continue to transform the world. And it's when we read these stories from our ancient ancestors, like from the Gospel of St. Matthew, whether it's the Beatitudes or the other parts of the Sermon on the Mount, like we're talking about today, it's about, like Samantha said, it's about living into this third way, living into a way of not absolute total power, but not absolute laying down and being a doormat. There is a middle way, there's a third way, and Jesus's moral and ethical teachings, especially found in the Sermon on the Mount and in the New Testament, are calling people of all persuasions, but particularly Christians, those who follow Jesus' teachings, to live in a new way and open yourself up to seeing things in a new way. So maybe for the next couple weeks or the next month or so, maybe listen to this podcast, but maybe read St. Matthew's Gospel, chapters 5, 6, and 7 in a new way, and see how Jesus' teachings, moral and ethical teachings, are really calling people to build a better, more just world for every person, for all of God's children. And so, I think that's all I have.
Yeah, that's good. And so I like to ground these things and not get too lofty. So once again, the whole point, and we can do this in our own lives even, if you find yourself in one of those tennis matches of trying to maintain power. So if somebody who thinks differently than you is like throwing facts in your direction and data and stats, and then you find yourself throwing stats back at them, and then they throw it back at you, and then you throw it back at them, just remember this part of the Sermon on the Mount. There's another way. Let's see if we can introduce a third way here. Can we resist this oppressive power without replacing it? So can we engage with these power systems even if we have a relationship where, like, I know a lot of people with parents or aunts and uncles or siblings or friends, it's very difficult sometimes because we see things differently. If you find yourself trying to like fight for the power in the conversation at like on Thanksgiving, at the Thanksgiving Day table, eating turkey, and you get into this argument, is there a third way? So that's what Jesus was teaching. Sometimes there's this third way. I'll say it again. Can we resist oppressive power without replacing it, without becoming it?
Right. That's very, very good. I would like to close us with with a little bit more tennis metaphor here. So it's okay when there's going back and forth and back and forth. If you're a tennis player, I love tennis, and I've played tennis for much of my life. And sometimes when you go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it's going over the net and going over the net and going over the net, you call that a volley. And that's all fun. That's great. There's nothing wrong with volleying, going back and forth. But I would like to leave everybody at this. The first score of tennis, when you get your first score, it is not 1, 2, or 3, but it is love. Love this. The first score in tennis is love. And Jesus' moral and ethical teachings call us to love people who are different than us, love people who see things different, and call us into this new way of living and being in the world. So to continue with that tennis metaphor, let's just stop at love.
So just so you all know, like Oz behind the curtain, Dylan didn't know about my tennis metaphor until we started recording.
Oh,
so this is just like, he's running with it.
But
and
now
I'm
going to be thinking about it all day, all night.
I like it. Okay, perfect. So once again, episode 5 is about turn the other cheek and these similar phrases. And once again, it's all about power. It's all about the Roman Empire. You can't understand it fully without understanding the Roman Empire. So episode 5, turn the other cheek. As always, follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. And we'll talk to you next time for episode 6.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.